She had 72 hours to find $300,000, or watch the only home her mother had ever known be taken by men who didn't care whether an old woman had somewhere to sleep. That was the morning Zadie Ellsworth answered an ad she almost deleted. Private estate, full-time domestic staff, immediate start. Discretion required. No company name, no address. Just a number and a warning printed at the bottom in small, deliberate letters. Those who cannot follow instructions need not apply. She almost laughed. Then she looked at the number on her mother's hospital bill again, and she called. Zadie had not grown up soft. She had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment in the south side of Chicago, with a mother who worked double shifts at a laundry and came home smelling like other people's clothes, and still found the energy to braid Zadie's hair before school. She had grown up understanding that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you carried yourself, regardless of what the world decided to do about it. She had a degree in hospitality management. She had spent 6 years managing operations at one of Chicago's finest boutique hotels, coordinating staff, handling VIP guests, solving problems before anyone knew they existed. She was good at her job. Exceptional, her last supervisor had written, in a recommendation letter that sat in a folder on her kitchen counter next to the eviction notice and the stack of medical invoices that had started arriving after her mother's second stroke. Her mother, Dolores Ellsworth, had lived in the same house in Woodlawn for 31 years. She had paid that mortgage faithfully, month after month, through a husband who left and the economy that didn't care, and 2 knees that gave out before she turned 60. Then the strokes came. First one, then another. The medical bills arrived like a second disaster. When Zadie lost her hotel position in the corporate restructuring, along with 40 other employees who received the same generic email on the same Tuesday morning, the math stopped working. She tried everything the right way first. She applied to every management position within commuting distance. She took on freelance event coordination. She sold furniture. She called every relative she had, which wasn't many, and asked for help she hated asking for. She extended every deadline she could and apologized to people she didn't owe apologies to. None of it was enough. The number on the ad rang twice before a woman answered with the clipped efficiency of someone who did not believe in pleasantries. Beck Residence, you're applying for the household position? Yes, Zadie said. Interview is tomorrow, 6 a.m. The address will be texted to you in 1 hour. If you're late, don't come. A pause. Do you have any objections to signing a confidentiality agreement? Zadie thought about her mother's house, about the way Dolores still tried to get up and make coffee on the mornings she was strong enough, as if the routine itself was a form of prayer. No, Zadie said. No objections. The address turned out to be in Lincoln Park, not the edges of Lincoln Park, where the neighborhood softened into something almost accessible. The deep interior, where the streets were wide and quiet and lined with trees old enough to remember a different Chicago, where the houses weren't houses so much as statements, limestone and iron and glass arranged to communicate, without a single word, that the people inside existed in a different category of life than the people walking past. The Beck estate sat behind a gate that Zadie nearly missed because it blended so precisely into the stone wall surrounding it. She pressed the intercom at exactly 5:58. The gate opened without a word. The woman who met her at the door was Korean, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and an expression that had probably never in its life been described as warm. Her name was Mrs. O, she said. She was the estate's head of household operations. She would conduct the first part of the interview. The interview lasted 40 minutes and covered everything from Zadie's experience with formal table service to her familiarity with traditional Korean household customs to whether she had ever, under any circumstances, discussed a previous employer's personal affairs with anyone outside the household. Never, Zadie said. Mrs. O looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of the word. Mr. Beck will see you now, she said finally. One instruction before you go in. Do not speak unless he asks you a direct question, and do not stare. Zadie almost asked why. Then she decided she would find out for herself. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, he wasn't speaking. She heard the quality of silence that preceded him into the room. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in a space simultaneously decides to be careful. She had been waiting in what she assumed was a sitting room, though it looked more like a gallery. Clean lines, dark wood, art on the walls that looked chosen for meaning rather than decoration. Two men in suits stood near the far door, and when it opened, both of them straightened in a way that wasn't quite standing at attention, but was close enough to matter. Riohan Bayek walked in like a man who had long since stopped noticing that rooms rearranged themselves around him. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his movement, wearing a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit when they've been made specifically for you. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, and his face, angular jaw, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled in recent memory, was the kind of face that would have been called handsome in any language. If handsome wasn't entirely beside the point when the eyes were like that. His eyes were the thing, dark, still, and completely alert, the kind of eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her with the particular ease of a man who had never in his life been uncertain about where he belonged. He looked at her resume. Then he looked at her. "You managed a 40-person hospitality staff," he said. His English was precise, accented but clear, each word placed with care. "Yes." "And you left. The position was eliminated. Restructuring." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved back to the paper, then returned to her face with the same unhurried attention. "This position requires full-time presence. You would live on the estate 6 days per week. Sundays are your own." He set the resume down. "The work is not difficult. The expectations are exacting. There is a difference. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Zadie said. "One is about effort. The other is about standard." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite interest. Something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. "The confidentiality agreement covers everything you see, hear, or encounter within these walls," he continued. "You do not discuss my schedule, my guests, my business, or my personal affairs with anyone. Not a friend, not a family member, not a lawyer unless compelled by law." He paused. "Are you capable of that?" "I've kept the confidences of people whose secrets were far more interesting than a schedule," Zadie said. "So yes." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. One of the suited men near the door shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Mrs. O, who had reappeared in the doorway, went very still. Riohan Bayek looked at Zadie Ellsworth for 3 full seconds without blinking. "The salary," he said, and named a number that made Zadie keep her face perfectly professionally neutral, despite the fact that it was nearly double what she'd made managing the hotel. "There is one thing," she said. He waited. "I need every other Sunday to be guaranteed. Not suggested. Guaranteed." She held his gaze. "My mother is ill. I see her on Sundays. That doesn't change." The room was very quiet. "Every other Sunday," he said finally. "Guaranteed." He stood, which seemed to signal that the interview was over. "Mrs. O will handle the paperwork. You start Monday." He walked back toward the door without looking at her again. "Mr. Beck," Zadie said. He stopped, didn't turn immediately. When he did, it was slow, the way a man turns when he's deciding whether the interruption was worth acknowledging. "Thank you," she said simply. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he left the room, and the air pressure changed when he did, the way it changes when something large and contained passes by. She moved into the estate on a grey Monday morning in October, with 2 suitcases and the quiet, focused energy of a woman who had made her decision and intended to honor it. The room she was given was on the 3rd floor of the east wing, small but immaculate, with a window that looked out over the rear garden and a bathroom with heated floors that she would never entirely get used to. Mrs. O gave her a tour that lasted 90 minutes and covered every room she was permitted to enter, the schedule for each, and the precise standards expected in each. Mr. Beck breakfasted at 6:15. He did not like to be spoken to before 7 unless it was an emergency. His coffee was taken black, no sugar, in a specific cup. She was shown which one. He worked from his home office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On those days, the hallway outside that office was to be kept clear between 8 a.m. and noon. He had guests on occasion. She would be informed in advance. She was not to engage guests in extended conversation. She was not to answer questions about the household. "Any questions?" Mrs. O asked at the end. "The garden," Zadie said. "Who maintains it?" Mrs. O looked briefly surprised, as if this was not a question she'd been asked before. "A groundskeeper comes Wednesdays. The roses near the east wall need attention before Wednesday," Zadie said. "A few of the canes are crossing. If they're not separated before the first freeze, they'll damage each other." Mrs. O looked at her for a moment. "I'll note it," she said. It was, Zadie would reflect later, the first time the older woman had looked at her with something other than assessment. The first 2 weeks passed in the disciplined rhythm of a household that ran like a system rather than a home. Zadie learned the patterns quickly, not just the rules, but the textures underneath them. The way the kitchen staff relaxed exactly 15 minutes after Mr. Bayek's car left the drive, the way Mrs. O kept a small photograph tucked inside her desk organizer, that she always turned face down when anyone else was in the room, the way the house itself seemed to breathe differently at night. She learned Riohan Bayek's patterns too, the way you learn the patterns of any environment you inhabit professionally. He was precise about time. He was rarely home before 7 in the evening. He ate dinner alone at the long dining table that could have seated 20, with a book or documents beside the plate, never a phone. He accepted the coffee each morning without comment. But on the third morning, when she'd adjusted the temperature by 2 degrees, because she'd noticed him wrap both hands around the cup the day before, as if warming them. He looked at the cup, then at her, without saying a word. She went back to her work. He said nothing. But the next morning the cup was exactly where she'd left it, placed back on the specific shelf she'd taken it from, which meant he'd noticed she had a system. Small things. She catalogued them without meaning to. On the second Friday, she came downstairs at 6 a.m. to find that one of the kitchen staff, a young woman named Priya who had seemed feverish the day before, had not come in. There was a glass of water and 2 tablets of medication on the small table outside Priya's door on the basement level. No note, no explanation. Zadie looked at the glass and the tablets for a moment. Then she went upstairs and made the coffee. The first conflict arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Wren. He came on a Thursday evening unannounced, which meant either he was accustomed to being received without notice, or he was testing something. He was white, perhaps 55, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades being told his time was worth more than other people's. He wore a watch that cost more than most cars, and smiled at Zadie when she opened the door with the smile of a man who had decided she was not worth categorizing. "I'm here for Beck," he said, without introduction. "Mr. Beck is not expecting guests this evening," Zadie said. "Your name?" he told her, as if the name itself should have opened the door automatically. She kept her expression pleasant and professional, and asked him to wait in the entrance hall while she checked with Mr. Beck. She found Riohan in his study, standing at the window with a glass of water, looking at something in the garden, or perhaps at nothing at all. He turned when she knocked on the open door. "Mr. Wren is here," she said. He didn't have an appointment. Something moved through Riohan's expression, not surprise, but something controlled and deliberate, like a man deciding how to hold a particular weight. "Send him to the front sitting room," he said. "Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes. "Of course." She turned to go. "Zadie." It was the first time he'd used her name. She turned back. "If he asked you anything about my schedule for the next 2 weeks, he said, "you know nothing." "I know nothing," she said, and meant it to sound like agreement rather than confirmation, which it was. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him yet, and it was gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. She went back downstairs and showed Douglas Wren to the sitting room with impeccable courtesy. And when he asked her with that particular smile how long she'd worked for Beck and whether she found it easy to keep up with a man like that, she looked at him with an expression of such professional blankness that he stopped smiling before he finished the sentence. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait, Mr. Wren?" she asked. He asked for scotch, neat. She brought it without comment. She did not tell him that she had noticed, when she went to the cabinet, that the bottle Riohan kept there for guests of this specific variety was not the good Scotch. She didn't see the exchange between the two men. She wasn't meant to. But she heard the quality of the silence afterward, the particular kind of silence that follows a conversation that ended with someone losing. And when Douglas Wren left 40 minutes later, his smile was entirely gone. Riohan did not come out of his study for the rest of the evening. At 9:30, she left a plate outside the study door. Not because it was her job, dinner was long past. Because she had learned that on evenings when the weight in the house was heavier than usual, the plate was always empty by morning. In the morning, it was empty. The weeks settled into a month, then 2. November arrived and brought the kind of cold that made Chicago feel like a different city, sharper, more honest, stripped of the warmth that summer allowed it to pretend to. Zadie's mother was having a better stretch. The new medication was working, the doctors said, and Dolores sounded like herself again on their Sunday calls, sharp-tongued and warm in the same breath, asking Zadie whether she was eating properly and whether the people she worked for deserved her. "They pay me fairly," Zadie said. "That's a start." "That's not what I asked," her mother said. Zadie thought about the glass of water outside Priya's door, about the cancelled meeting she'd discovered on the schedule, a 3-hour block moved without explanation, that had happened to fall on the same afternoon the estate's elderly groundskeeper, Mr. Juan, had needed to be driven to a medical appointment and had no one to take him. She hadn't been told these things directly. She simply noticed them, the way you notice the architecture of a place once you've lived in it long enough. "I don't know yet," she told her mother. The argument happened on a Tuesday. She hadn't been meant to hear it. She'd been in the corridor outside the east sitting room to collect a tray when the voices had started. One of them Riohan's, controlled but with an edge-like wire pulled tight. The other belonging to a woman she hadn't seen before, perhaps 40, elegant in the particular way of women who have learned to make elegance into armor. The woman was speaking in Korean. Zadie didn't understand the words, but she understood tone, the accusation in it, the old wound that had never properly healed and had been reopened by whatever had brought this woman here today. She also understood the quality of Riohan's responses. Short, flat, deliberate. A man who was not going to give whoever this was the satisfaction of a reaction. Then the woman switched to English. Zadie wasn't sure if it was for emphasis or because English felt colder, more suited to what she wanted to say. "You have made this house into a machine," the woman said. "You hired strangers to fill the rooms so you don't have to feel what's missing. That's not living, Riohan, that's hiding." A pause. "Leave," he said. One word, in that particular tone that she had come to understand, meant the conversation was over. Not because he'd won, but because he'd decided it wasn't worth continuing. Zadie picked up the tray and moved silently back down the corridor. That evening she left his coffee earlier than usual and said nothing when he appeared in the kitchen doorway at an odd hour, still in his suit. His tie loosened in the one concession to discomfort she'd ever observed in him. He looked at her, and she looked back, and she did what she always did in moments like this. She didn't pretend she hadn't noticed he was there, and she didn't make it into something it didn't need to be. "Your coffee is on the counter," she said, "still hot." He stood there for a moment. Then he came in and poured the coffee himself, which he never did. She went back to what she was doing. "The woman today," he said, which surprised her because he never explained himself. He was looking into his cup. "My sister." She said nothing. She wasn't sure what he expected her to do with that information. She wasn't sure he knew either. "She comes once a year to tell me I'm wrong about something," he said. There was no self-pity in it, just the flat shape of a fact. "Does she have a point?" Zadie asked. The question landed in the room with more weight than she'd intended. She kept her hands busy, not looking at him, giving him the option of ignoring it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had. "Usually," he said finally. She looked up then. He was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them looked away, and the kitchen was very quiet, and outside the window, the Chicago wind moved through the garden and rattled the last dry leaves from the elm tree near the east wall. "Good night, Mr. Beck," she said. "Good night, Zadie," he said, and left her standing in the warm kitchen with the feeling that something had shifted, though she could not have said precisely what. December came in cold and certain. The estate was decorated for the season, not excessively, but with the kind of careful restraint that characterizes people who know the difference between elegance and performance. Mrs. O oversaw it, and Zadie helped. And it was in the middle of this, standing on a ladder hanging something above the entrance hall, that she first noticed the portrait. It was in the corridor between the main hall and the east wing, at a height that made it easy to overlook. A family portrait, formal, the kind that sits for years on the walls of houses where generations overlap. A younger Riohan, he looked perhaps 25, stood behind an older couple. His parents, she thought. His mother was small and composed. His father stood with the bearing of a man who had built something and wanted the world to know it. Riohan in the portrait was not smiling. He was looking at the camera with the same directness she saw in him every day, but there was something different about it, something younger and less resolved, as if the composure she recognized was still being assembled, not yet complete. She was looking at it when she heard him in the corridor behind her. She stepped down from the ladder and turned, expecting the usual brief acknowledgement and passage, but he had stopped. He was looking at the portrait too, and his face had the quality of a man looking at something he usually moves past quickly without stopping, now stopped. "Your family?" she asked. It was probably too direct. She seemed to keep being too direct with him, and it kept not going the way it probably should. "My parents," he said. "My father died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." He looked at the portrait for another moment, his jaw set. Then, "Were you close to your father?" The question surprised her. He asked so few questions. "No," she said. "He left when I was 7. My mother raised me alone." He turned to look at her. Something in his expression shifted, not pity, which she would have disliked, but something more complicated. Something that looked briefly like the recognition of a shared architecture. "Mrs. O tells me your mother is doing better," he said. Zadie blinked. She hadn't told Mrs. O in any detail. She'd mentioned once that her mother had a good appointment. She hadn't realized it had been noted, passed along, retained. "She is?" Zadie said carefully. "Thank you." He nodded once. The brief opening in his expression had closed again. He moved past her down the corridor, and she watched him go, and she stood in front of the portrait for another long moment before she went back to the ladder. The trouble with Douglas Wren came back in January. She learned about it second-hand, the way she learned most things in this house, through the careful attention she paid to details that other people assumed went unnoticed. There had been a business complication. Something about a property acquisition that Wren had moved on after Riohan had refused to partner with him, moved on in a way that suggested he'd had access to information he shouldn't have had. The lawyers were involved. The house was tense for a week, in the particular way it became tense when Riohan's attention was fully occupied by something he was working to resolve. On the third night of that week, she passed his study at 11 p.m. and saw the light still on under the door. She knocked. A pause. "Yes." She opened the door. He was at his desk, surrounded by documents, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked up, and something in his eyes said clearly that he was deep in the middle of something and had not yet decided whether the interruption was welcome. She held up the coffee she'd brought. Still black, still hot. He looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed the side of his face with one hand, the first gesture of fatigue she had ever seen from him, and said, "Sit down." She sat. Not because she'd been told to exactly, because the way he said it suggested something other than an instruction. She set the coffee on the desk and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that your answer doesn't affect your position here." "All right," she said. "Is there anything you've heard in this house or seen that you've discussed with anyone outside these walls?" She held his gaze directly. "No." He watched her face the way he always watched, with that complete, unhurried attention that made other people uncomfortable and that she had simply decided to meet steadily. "Wren's people were watching the estate," he said. "That's what my lawyers believe. They had information they should not have had about my schedule and my meetings." He picked up the coffee cup. I'm not accusing you. I'm informing you because you have a right to know that this situation exists." Zadie was quiet for a moment. "The Thursday he came," she said, "unannounced. I told you he was here, and you said to tell him you'd be down in 10 minutes. She paused. "Your calendar. I can see it when I coordinate the household schedule. The meeting you had that morning was with a property attorney. The address of the property was on the printed calendar on the kitchen organizer." She watched him go still. "I moved the calendar to the locked drawer the following week," she said. "I should have mentioned it. I assumed it was a security measure you'd already taken." She paused. "I apologize for the assumption." He looked at her for a long moment. "You moved it without saying anything," he said slowly. "Why?" "Because it seemed obvious," she said, "and I thought you'd already handled it." She met his gaze. "I clearly thought wrong." Another long silence. "You noticed a security vulnerability in my household," he said quietly, corrected it and didn't say anything. "It seemed like the kind of thing that was already known. It wasn't. I know that now." Something was happening in his expression that she couldn't quite name. He picked up the coffee and drank it and set the cup down and looked at the document in front of him. And she waited. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me now." She stood. "Good night, Mr. Beck." She was at the door when he said, "Zadie." She turned. "Thank you," he said again, and this time it meant something different. She wasn't entirely sure what, but she knew it did. February. The house had a particular quality in February, the cold at its most settled, the garden patient under its thin layer of frost, the long evenings pressing against the windows with the specific weight of a season that has been going on long enough that you've stopped expecting it to end. And yet, there was something in the house that felt, to Zadie, different from October. Less formal, not warm exactly, but less defended. She noticed it in small things. Rio Han had begun, without announcement or explanation, to spend time in the kitchen in the evenings, not often, not predictably, but occasionally, working at the kitchen table rather than in his study. He brought his documents. He did not speak to her. She continued working. It was a form of coexistence that she found, to her mild surprise, entirely comfortable. She noticed it in the way he occasionally asked questions. Not personal questions, not yet, but questions that were one step warmer than professional. Had she always been interested in horticulture? No, she said, but her mother had a small garden, and Zadie had learned the way you learn things that matter to someone you love. He absorbed this without comment. 3 days later, she found a volume on Korean traditional garden design on the kitchen table, left with the particular care of something placed for someone to find without the placing being acknowledged. She left it on the shelf near the window and said nothing. But she read it, every page. She noticed it in the way his assistant had stopped calling him by his title when Zadie was nearby, and now sometimes called him, in the slightly startled way of people making a change they haven't quite gotten used to, by his given name. As if the small informalities were spreading outward from something at the center, she also noticed the moment she understood she was in trouble. It was a Sunday. Not her Sunday she'd swapped with the schedule. And she was in the garden in the cold, doing work that was technically the groundskeeper's domain, but that she'd taken on because the idea of the roses going unattended bothered her. She was kneeling in the frost, her hands in her gloves, separating 2 canes that had grown together over the winter, when she became aware that she was being observed. She looked up. Rio Han was standing at the library window on the 2nd floor. He wasn't hidden. He was simply standing there, looking at the garden, which happened to contain her. When she looked up, he didn't look away, which she had come to understand was characteristic of him. He looked away from nothing. He simply waited until whatever he was looking at was done being looked at. She went back to the roses. When she looked up again 10 minutes later, he was gone. But the feeling remained. Something she had been managing, keeping professional, keeping contained, had shifted. Not by much. By the amount that anything shifts when you stop pretending it isn't there. She told herself it was inconvenient. It was. She told herself it was inappropriate. It probably was. She told herself it would pass. She was not entirely certain it would. The gala was in March. An annual event, she was told. a charity fundraiser that Ryohan attended as a matter of obligation rather than preference. She could tell this from the way his jaw set when Mrs. O went over the evening's itinerary. The estate would host the after-reception, which meant a week of preparation, and a staff expanded by a catering company for the night. She managed the preparation the way she managed everything, with total competence and quiet authority. The catering team responded to her without the resistance that sometimes came when outside staff had to take direction from estate staff, which she attributed partly to her manner and partly to the fact that she was simply very clear about what she wanted. The night of the gala, she was not attending. Her role was the estate, the reception, the logistics. She was in the kitchen overseeing the assembly of the dessert course when she heard the guests arrive, the particular sound of a crowd that has been told to arrive at 8 and has done so. She came out briefly to ensure the entrance hall was right, and that was when she saw the woman beside Ryohan. She was perhaps 35, Korean, in a gown the color of garnet, with the particular ease of someone for whom this kind of evening was native territory. She stood at Ryohan's side with the practiced proximity of someone who expected to be there. Ryohan was speaking to guests with the controlled cordiality he put on for these events like a second suit, and the woman was beside him. And the picture they made was so natural that Zadie felt something in her chest close and harden like a fist. She went back to the kitchen. She was not, she told herself, feeling what she was feeling. She was a professional. She had a job. She did the job. She did not come out again until the guests had moved deeper into the house. Later, much later, after the last guest had left and the catering staff were packing up and the house was quieting, she was in the garden getting cold air, which she needed, when she heard the door. Ryohan came out with his jacket in one hand and his tie loosened, and she turned to face him, and there was a moment where both of them stood in the cold night and said nothing. "The reception went well," she said, "because something needed to be said." "Yes." He looked at her. The garden was lit only by what came through the windows, and in that light his face was difficult to read, which was usual but also somehow more pronounced. "You didn't come inside for the reception." "I was working." "You were avoiding something." The directness of it surprised her. It was her style, not his. She met his eyes steadily. "I was working, Mr. Beck." Something shifted in his face. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, in that particular way of his, the kind that felt like being read by someone who had learned to read at a very high level. "The woman tonight," he said quietly, "is someone my mother has been trying to arrange a match with for 3 years. We are not together. We have never been together." A pause. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know." The night was very cold and very still. The frost had come back and the bare elm trees were motionless, and somewhere far away Chicago was happening, but here in this garden it was just the two of them and the silence. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said. "No," he said. "I don't." He looked at the garden. "I gave it anyway." She didn't know what to say to that. She found, for perhaps the first time since she'd walked through the gate in October, that she did not know what to say. She looked at the roses, just visible in the low light, new growth barely beginning at the base of the canes she'd separated. "They're going to bloom early this year," she said, "the way the winter is going." He followed her gaze. "Is that good?" "It's beautiful," she said, "and it means the canes have to be checked again. The early warmth can fool them, and then the frost comes back and does damage." She paused. "You have to stay watchful." She was not entirely talking about roses, and from the way he looked at her when she turned back to face him, she understood that he knew she wasn't. "Good night, Mr. Beck," she said, and went inside before either of them could say anything else that couldn't be taken back. The break came from outside. It arrived in the form of a man named Calvin Voss, a business reporter who had been working on a story about Ryohan's business dealings for the better part of a year. He had been, according to Mrs. O's clipped explanation to the household, attempting to gain access to sources within the estate. He appeared at the gate on a Tuesday afternoon. When Zadie answered the intercom, he identified himself and asked to speak with any member of the household staff. She told him politely that she had no comment on behalf of the estate. "I'm not asking for a formal statement," he said. "I just want to understand what kind of man Bike is. Off the record, I've heard things—" "I understand what you've heard," she said. "The gate won't be opening." That should have been the end of it. It was not. He found her 3 days later, at the farmer's market 2 blocks from the estate where she went on Wednesday mornings for produce. A freedom Ryohan had extended without being asked when he'd noticed early on that the quality of what she bought was better than what the estate's regular supplier provided. Calvin Voss was waiting, which meant he'd been watching, which meant this was no longer a reporter casting wide and hoping. He was careful. He was even, she admitted, reasonably good at this, not aggressive, not accusatory, asking questions that were shaped like conversation. He told her he had sources suggesting Ryohan's business practices involved activities that the public had a right to know about. He told her he understood working for a man like that must be complicated. He told her that anything she said would be entirely anonymous. Zadie picked up a bundle of time and held it and looked at Calvin Voss. "What you're doing," she said calmly, "is attempting to use someone in a domestic work position to access information about an employer, under the assumption that I'm likely to be resentful or uninformed enough about the legal implications to say something I shouldn't." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm not going to do that. Not because I fear the consequences, because I have nothing to say that would support whatever story you're building." "You haven't heard what I know about him," Voss said. "And I'm not interested in what you know," she said, "because what I know is what I've seen, and what I've seen is a household run with care for the people in it. That's my experience. You're welcome to print that if it's useful." She paid for the time. "Have a good day, Mr. Voss." She walked back to the estate and did not tell Ryohan that evening, because she needed to think about whether it was her place to say anything, and because she wanted to be certain that what she'd said to Voss was the full truth before she repeated it to the man it was about. It was. She was certain of that. She told him the following morning over coffee, standing in the kitchen. She told him everything Voss had said and everything she had said back. And when she finished, he was very still in the way she had come to understand meant he was processing something that required stillness. "You told him you had nothing to say that would support his story," Ryohan said slowly. "Yes, and that was true." "Yes," she said, "that was true." He looked at her. The kitchen was warm, and the morning light was coming through the window, and it was the most ordinary possible setting for the particular weight of what was happening in it. "My reputation," he said, and she noticed the slight roughness in his voice, the edge that appeared when something mattered to him that he hadn't expected to matter, "was built before I came to this city. I know what people say about me. I know what that reporter has heard." He paused. "Most of it is the kind of thing that happens when a man builds something powerful in a business culture that wasn't designed for someone like him. And some of it is accurate. I have operated in spaces that were not always clean. I don't apologize for what allowed my family to survive." His jaw was set. "But this household, the people in it, have nothing to do with any of that. They work hard. They deserve what I pay them and more." Another pause. "You deserve more." Zadie was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware of your reputation," she said. "I was aware of it when I came here. I made my decision based on what I observed, not what I'd been told." "And what did you observe?" "A man," she said simply, "who is more careful with other people's dignity than most." She held his gaze. "That doesn't mean I know everything about you. It means I know what I've seen." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a pair of sparrows landed on the garden wall and left again. "I came to this city," he said finally, "because my father's empire was failing and someone had to rebuild it. I spent 7 years making it stable. I closed off most of what was left of my personal life in order to do it." He looked at his coffee cup. "My sister says I turned the process into a habit." "She sounds perceptive," Zadie said. The corner of his mouth moved, that barely there thing that she had learned to read as laughter in a man who had forgotten the full version. "She's insufferable," he said, with a warmth in it that told her he meant the opposite. "She found the evidence on a Thursday in late March. She wasn't looking for it. She was reorganizing the storage room adjacent to the kitchen, A practical task, nothing more. When she came across a small wooden box that had been placed on a high shelf behind a stack of linens, it had clearly been there for some time. She lifted it down to move it, and the lid was not secured, and it opened. Inside were documents, a stack of them clipped together. At the top was an invoice from a medical billing company, the kind that handles disputes and negotiations. It was addressed to a Dolores Ellsworth, and the amount at the bottom in the highlighted resolution column read, "Balance settled. No further payment required." She stood very still. The date on the document was November. 4 months ago. Beneath the invoice was a record of the settlement, the negotiated amount, the account it had been paid from. An account she did not recognize. She would have recognized her mother's account. She would have recognized the small amount she'd been contributing herself. She did not recognize this one. She closed the box. She stood in the storage room for a long moment with her hand on the shelf. Then she went to find him. He was in the library reading, and looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in her face must have said something, because he set the book down with the particular care of a man who senses that this conversation requires both hands free. She held up the box. His expression did not collapse into guilt or scramble for explanation. He simply looked at her, and then he looked at the box, and something settled in his jaw that was the expression of a man being seen in a way he hadn't decided to allow. "When?" she said, and her voice was very steady because she had decided it would be. "Did you do this?" "November," he said. "Why?" A pause. "Because you came here for your mother," he said. "Because you said the Sundays were non-negotiable." He looked at the box. "Because I listened to a phone call you had in the garden. I didn't intend to, you were outside my window. And I understood that the situation was worse than a few medical appointments." He met her eyes. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't allow it." She held his gaze. "You were right," she said. "I wouldn't have. I know. So you decided for me." "Yes." She stood there with the box in her hands and thought about her mother who was doing better, who sounded like herself, who called every Sunday and asked whether the people she worked for deserved her. She thought about the glass of water outside Priya's door, about the portrait in the corridor and the book on Korean gardens, and the way he stood outside her window watching the roses when he thought no one was watching him, about every small, unacknowledged act of care she had been cataloguing for 6 months without fully understanding what she was cataloguing. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." "I don't want to be managed, Rye-Johan." It was the first time she'd used his name, and it landed in the room between them with all the weight of that fact, and she watched his expression shift at the sound of it. "I need you to understand that. I can accept help. I'm not too proud for help when it matters, but I need to be the one who accepts it, not the one it's quietly done around." He stood. He moved from behind the desk, slowly, deliberately, the way he moved always, and stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she was fully aware of the distance they'd spent 6 months maintaining. "You're right," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "I overstepped. I did it because I didn't know how to do it the other way." His eyes didn't move from hers. "I don't have a great deal of practice with—" He stopped. A muscle moved in his jaw. "With wanting something I hadn't anticipated wanting." The library was very quiet. Outside the windows the garden was alive with March, new green, pale and certain, pushing up through the last of the frost. "What are you saying?" she said, though she knew. She simply wanted to hear it said plainly with words, because she had learned that the things left unsaid between people were the ones that eventually became walls. "I'm saying," he said, "that this started as a professional arrangement, and it is no longer only that." He held her gaze with the full force of the attention he put on everything, the attention that had unsettled her on the first day, and that she had learned, over 6 months, to stand in without flinching. "And I don't want to pretend otherwise." She set the box down on the table beside her. "I'm still employed by you," she said. "You're still employed by the estate," he said. "That can change, if you want it to." "You'd let me go." "I'd let you go," he said, or I'd ask you to stay. Both options exist. Only one of them is what I want." He paused. "What I want is for you to stay, not because of the position, because of you. But I understand that these are not the same thing, and I will not conflate them." She looked at him, this man who had taken a reporter's questions about his character and responded with the plain truth of what he was, who had never asked her to pretend that things were other than they were, and who had not, she thought, ever been pretending with her. "The confidentiality agreement," she said, "can be dissolved," he said immediately. "Today, if you want. And the arrangement, the household position, would need to change," he said. "If what I'm asking is what I'm asking," he was very still. "I am asking, to be clear." She thought about October, about a gate opening for her, and a house that had been, she'd thought, simply a place to work for the money she needed, about the way she'd learned the difference, in this house, between cold and contained, between armor and the wounds it was built to protect. "I have one condition," she said. He waited. He was very good at waiting. "My mother is doing well now," she said. "I want to keep it that way, and any decision made about her care, about anything that involves her, I am part of that decision, not informed after, part of it." His expression opened, the way she had watched it open very rarely, in the small moments when whatever he kept locked down inside him was briefly visible. "Yes," he said without pause, "always." She looked at him. Then she crossed the few feet between them. She did the crossing, she decided to do the crossing, and she held out her hand. Not for a handshake, for something more like a covenant. He looked down at her hand, and then took it, and his hand was warm and certain around hers, and when he looked back up at her face there was something in his eyes she had not seen before. Something unguarded, something that looked in the best and most specific way like relief. His other hand came up and cupped her jaw, slowly, with the deliberate care he gave everything. He looked at her face the way he had looked at the garden that morning through the window, as if what he was looking at was worth the full weight of his attention. When he kissed her it was quiet and certain, like something that had been decided a long time ago and was only now being acknowledged. The formal paperwork was completed on a Monday morning. The household contract, the original agreement with its confidentiality clause and its terms and its 6-day-per-week schedule, was set on the desk between them. Riohan slid a pen across the wood and Zadie signed the termination document. And he signed it too, and Mrs. O witnessed it with the expression of a woman who had seen this coming for months and had decided to be satisfied about it. "The confidentiality agreement?" Zadie asked. "Dissolved," he said. "Though I'd appreciate your continued discretion on principle." "That was always on principle," she said. He looked at her with something that was unmistakably the full version of what she'd been reading as almost smiles for 6 months. When he actually smiled, rarely, slowly, with the particular quality of something long saved, it was worth every moment of patience. "I've spoken to a property manager," he said. "Your mother's house. The title is clear now. The payments will continue from a trust I've set up. It's not a gift before you argue with me." He held her gaze evenly. "It's a wrong I made right without asking permission. The ongoing piece is the part I'm asking permission for now." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Ask." "May I," he said, "take care of your mother's home?" She looked at this man, this careful, controlled, deeply private man who had spent 6 months being slowly seen and had not, in the end, retreated from what he found looking back at him. And she thought about every wall she'd watched him build and the specific deliberateness with which he was now taking them down. "Yes," she said, "you may." April came in quietly. Dolores Ellsworth came to the estate for the first time on a Sunday in early April, which was technically no longer Zadie's day off, but had become instead simply a day that belonged to whatever mattered most. Dolores arrived the way she arrived everywhere, steadily, upright, with the particular dignity of a woman who had carried difficult things for a long time and had learned to carry them without letting them change her posture. She sat in the garden, and Riohan brought her tea, and he brought it properly, in the right cup, at the right temperature, and Dolores accepted it and looked at him with the clear, unhurried gaze of a woman who had raised a daughter in her own image and knew exactly what she was looking at. "My daughter tells me you're precise," Dolores said. "I try to be," he said. "She says you don't waste words." "I try not to." Dolores looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter. Then she looked back at Ryo-han. "Good," she said simply, and lifted her tea. Later, when Dolores had been driven home, and the garden was quiet in the long golden light of an April evening that was finally warm enough to sit in without a coat, Zadie was on the bench near the roses, which were budding, exactly as she'd predicted, 2 weeks ahead of any reasonable expectation, when Ryo-han came and sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her. The length of his shoulder against hers, the particular intimacy of proximity that was chosen rather than formal. "She approved," he said. "She approved of the tea service," Zadie said. "The jury is still out on everything else." "She stayed for 3 hours," he said. "She likes gardens," Zadie said. "Don't read too much into it." He looked at the roses. She looked at him. "I have lived in this house," he said quietly, "for 4 years. In that time I have employed 47 people in various capacities. I have had 212 business meetings in the front sitting room and 46 dinners at that table." He paused. "I have not once in 4 years sat in this garden in the evening." She said nothing, listening. "I want you to know," he said, "that this is not a small thing." He turned to look at her. "That you are not a small thing." The roses were moving in a slight wind that carried the first real warmth of the season. In the distance, Chicago continued its enormous, indifferent life, full of people and noise and the 10,000 urgent matters that fill a city from edge to edge. Here, in this particular garden, in this particular evening, there was only the quiet. She had signed a contract to save her mother. She had walked through a gate looking for money and necessity, and a way to hold one important life together at the seams. She had found, in the coldest house she'd ever walked into, in the most contained man she'd ever stood in front of, something she had not known she was looking for. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the bench. The roses were going to bloom early this year, and the frost, when it came, would find them ready.